Jack sat hunched over on the cold pavement, his tattered coat barely shielding him from the biting wind. The city never slept, but for people like him, people without a home, it was an endless cycle of struggle. He had been living on the streets for years, surviving on scraps and discarded bottles, scavenging what little he could to trade for a few coins. His beard had grown thick and unkempt, his hair matted with dust and grime from months of neglect. Once, long ago, he had a life, a job, a family, a place to return to at the end of the day. But that life was gone, lost in the tides of misfortune, and now he was just another nameless soul drifting through the city's alleyways. His days were spent rummaging through trash bins, collecting empty cans and bottles that could be exchanged for a few cents. Sometimes, he would sit at the corner of a busy street with a small cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." But most passers-by barely spared him a glance. Some people were cruel. They muttered insults under their breath, scoffed at him as they walked by, or even threw coins at him with a sneer, as if he were nothing more than a stain on the sidewalk. Others ignored him completely, their eyes sliding past him as though he were invisible. The few who did stop to offer him food or kind words were rare, and he treasured those small acts of kindness like precious gems. Jack's greatest enemy, however, was not the cold or hunger. It was loneliness. He had no one to talk to, no one to share his pain or his dreams with. Each night, as he curled up under a thin, dirty blanket in a desolate alley, he stared at the starless sky and wondered how he had ended up here. When had life turned against him? When had the world decided that he was no longer worthy of love or dignity? There were nights when he thought about giving up. The streets were merciless, and every day felt like a battle he was slowly losing. But something inside him, some stubborn ember of willpower, refused to let go. Maybe it was the memory of his daughter's laughter, the echo of a life he once had. Maybe it was hope, however faint, that tomorrow might bring something better. On this particular evening, as Jack sat outside a convenience store, watching people come and go with bags full of food he could only dream of eating, he pulled his coat tighter around himself. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and his stomach twisted in painful knots. He considered going to the nearby shelter, but they were always full, and he had long since grown tired of the humiliation of being turned away. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing loudly. One of them glanced at Jack and smirked before tossing a crumpled dollar bill at his feet. "Here you go, old man," the boy said mockingly. "Buy yourself a mansion." His friends erupted into laughter as they disappeared down the street. Jack let out a slow breath and picked up the dollar. Insults no longer stung the way they once did. He had grown numb to them, just as he had grown numb to the hunger and the cold. A few minutes later, an elderly woman exited the store and paused in front of him. She was dressed in a thick wool coat, her silver hair neatly tied back. Unlike the others, she looked at him, really looked at him. "You must be freezing," she said softly. She reached into her shopping bag and pulled out a sandwich, wrapped in paper. "Here, take this." Jack hesitated before accepting the food. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured. His voice was hoarse from disuse. She nodded, giving him a warm smile before walking away. Jack unwrapped the sandwich carefully, savoring the simple but rare kindness. The world could be cruel, but sometimes, just sometimes, there were still people who saw him as more than just a homeless man. As he took his first bite, he whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow will be better." Ethan Reynolds was a man who seemingly had it all. At 35, he was the CEO of a thriving tech company, a self-made millionaire who had built his empire from the ground up. He lived in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city skyline, drove an expensive car, and had connections in all the right places. To the world, Ethan was the definition of success. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a void in his heart that no amount of wealth or power could fill. That void was his father, Jack. Ethan had never truly known his father. His memories of Jack were hazy at best, fragments of a childhood that felt like a distant dream. He remembered laughter, strong arms lifting him into the air, the warmth of a father's embrace. But then, one day, Jack was gone. No explanations, no goodbyes, just an absence that left a scar on Ethan's soul. For years, he had tried to move on. He told himself that Jack had left by choice, that he was better off without a father who had abandoned him. But deep down, he could never truly believe that. There had to be a reason, something that had forced Jack to disappear from his life. And so, the search began. Ethan had spent years looking for his father, hiring private investigators, searching through old records, and scouring every possible lead. But every effort led to nothing. It was as if Jack had vanished into thin air. The frustration gnawed at him, the constant cycle of hope and disappointment wearing him down. Late at night, when the city lights twinkled outside his window, Ethan would sit in his study, flipping through old photographs. One picture in particular haunted him, a faded Polaroid of a young boy sitting on his father's lap, both of them smiling. He traced the edges of the photo with his fingers, wondering where that man had gone. Was Jack still alive? Did he ever think about the son he had left behind? His mother, Diane, rarely spoke about Jack. Whenever Ethan pressed her for answers, she would simply shake her head and say, "Some things are better left in the past." But Ethan refused to accept that. The past was a puzzle, and he was determined to put the pieces together. One evening, as he sat in his office, he received a call from his investigator. "We might have something," the man said. "A possible sighting in the downtown area. A homeless man matching your father's description." Ethan's heart pounded. Could it be him? He wasted no time, grabbing his coat and rushing out the door. The city streets were bustling with life, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the possibility that, after all these years, he might finally be close to finding Jack. As he approached the area described by his investigator, he slowed down, scanning the faces of the homeless men and women huddled in alleyways and on park benches. His stomach twisted at the sight. So many lost souls, forgotten by society. Was his father among them? He spotted an old man sitting against a brick wall, wrapped in a tattered coat, staring blankly at the ground. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's features were worn, his hair long and unkempt, but there was something familiar about him. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said softly. The man looked up, his eyes dull and tired. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Ethan felt a flicker of recognition. Could it really be him? But then, the man shook his head and looked away. "I don't have anything to give you, son," he muttered. Ethan's heart sank. He wanted to ask, to press further, but fear held him back. What if he was wrong? What if this wasn't Jack? Or worse, what if it was, and his father no longer remembered him? He turned away, his hands clenched into fists. The search wasn't over, but for tonight, it was another dead end. As he walked back to his car, he whispered to himself, "I will find you, Dad, no matter what it takes." It was an ordinary afternoon in New York City's Central Park. The winter chill still lingered in the air, but the sun was bright, casting golden rays over the scattered crowds. People jogged along winding paths, children played on the playgrounds, and street performers entertained tourists. Among them, Jack sat on a worn-out bench near a quiet section of the park, wrapped in his tattered coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He had been coming to this park for years, finding solace in the rustling trees and the distant laughter of strangers. The streets had hardened him, but here, at least for a short while, he could pretend he was just another visitor enjoying the peace of the city. Ethan walked briskly through the park, his mind occupied with the same relentless thought that had haunted him for years, his father. He had exhausted every lead, searched every shelter, and combed through countless streets, always ending up with nothing. But something today felt different. Call it instinct, fate, or sheer coincidence, but something told him he was close. As he turned a corner, his eyes scanned the benches. Most were occupied by couples, elderly folks feeding pigeons, or groups of friends chatting. But then, his gaze landed on an older man sitting alone, staring at the pavement. There was something familiar about him. The slouched shoulders, the rugged face weathered by time. And then, Ethan saw it. A scar. A long, jagged scar running down the man's forearm, partially visible under the frayed sleeve of his coat. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. His heart pounded as memories rushed back. Childhood moments of holding his father's hand, of tracing that very scar with his tiny fingers, asking how he had gotten it. His voice came out as a whisper, almost afraid to break the moment. "Dad?" Jack's body stiffened. He lifted his head slowly, his tired eyes meeting Ethan's. There was confusion at first, then shock, and finally, a flicker of recognition. He blinked as if trying to convince himself that this wasn't another cruel trick his mind was playing on him. "Ethan?" Jack's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he took a hesitant step forward. He had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed the words he would say, but now, standing in front of his long-lost father, all he could do was stare in disbelief. Jack's own eyes misted over as he slowly stood up from the bench. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan nodded, unable to speak, and then, in one swift motion, he closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around his father. Jack hesitated for a split second before returning the embrace, his rough, calloused hands gripping Ethan tightly, as if afraid that letting go would make this moment disappear. Neither of them spoke for what felt like eternity. They simply stood there, holding onto each other, years of separation dissolving in the warmth of a long-overdue reunion. The world around them blurred, the passers-by, the sounds of the park, the cold wind. Nothing else mattered. "I looked for you," Ethan finally said, his voice breaking. "For so many years." Jack closed his eyes, guilt washing over him. "I know," he murmured. I thought you'd be better off without me." Ethan pulled back slightly, shaking his head. "How could I be better without my father?" Jack wiped at his eyes, trying to contain the overwhelming emotions. He had spent years convincing himself that he had lost everything, that he was nothing more than a forgotten shadow. Yet here his son stood, proof that love and hope had never abandoned him. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, "for everything." Ethan tightened his grip on his father's shoulders. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that I found you." Jack let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I never stopped thinking about you, son." Ethan smiled through his tears. "Then let's make up for lost time." For the first time in years, Jack felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. As they sat back down on the bench, side by side, Ethan held onto his father's hand, unwilling to let go. A new chapter of their lives had begun. The drive back to Ethan's home was filled with a silence that spoke louder than words. Jack stared out of the car window, watching the city blur past him. He still couldn't believe this was real, that after years of hardship, of loneliness, of being forgotten by the world, his son had found him. More than that, Ethan had taken him in. Ethan's home was nothing like what Jack was used to. It was modern, spacious, and filled with warmth, something Jack had not felt in a long time. The moment they stepped inside, Ethan led him to the guest room, a space that was clean and comfortable. "You'll stay here," Ethan said softly, placing a fresh set of clothes on the bed. "There's a shower if you need it, and I'll bring you some food." Jack hesitated before nodding. The thought of sleeping on an actual bed, with warm blankets, seemed like a luxury he didn't deserve. But the exhaustion in his bones was undeniable. He muttered a quiet, "Thank you," before heading into the bathroom. The warm water cascaded over him, washing away the grime of the streets, but it couldn't wash away the years of pain. He stood under the stream for what felt like hours, letting the heat soak into his skin, his mind wrestling with emotions too complex to name. Over the next few days, Ethan dedicated himself to helping his father regain his strength. Jack had lived in survival mode for so long that he barely remembered what it was like to be cared for. He struggled with the sudden change, feeling like an outsider in his own son's world. But Ethan was patient. He prepared warm meals, coaxing Jack into eating properly. He helped him into clean clothes, made sure he rested, and most of all, he listened. He never pushed, never demanded answers. He simply let Jack exist, healing at his own pace. One of the biggest battles was Jack's drinking. Years of trauma and hardship had driven him to alcohol, numbing the pain that never seemed to fade. Ethan had noticed the way his father's hands shook when he hadn't had a drink in hours, the way his eyes darted toward the kitchen, searching for an escape. "We need to do this, Dad," Ethan said one evening. sitting across from him at the dining table. You can't keep drowning yourself in it. Jack let out a bitter laugh. It's not that simple, son. I know, Ethan replied, his voice steady, but I'm here to help. You don't have to do this alone. Jack met his son's gaze, seeing nothing but sincerity in his eyes. He had spent so long running, pushing people away, believing he was beyond saving. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. And so, the battle began. Ethan helped Jack through the withdrawal symptoms, staying by his side when the shakes and night sweats took over. When the nightmares came, haunting flashes of a past Jack wished he could forget, Ethan was there to ground him, reminding him that he was safe now. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Jack wanted to give up, to disappear back into the shadows where no one would expect anything from him. But Ethan refused to let him fall. You're stronger than this, Ethan reminded him during the hardest nights. You've survived so much. You can survive this too. Slowly but surely, Jack began to heal. His body grew stronger with each passing day. The deep hollowness in his face began to fade, replaced by a healthier glow. His mind, once fogged by alcohol and despair, started to clear. Ethan also arranged for Jack to see a therapist, someone who specialized in PTSD. At first, Jack resisted. He had spent years burying his pain. Digging it up again felt unbearable. But the more he talked, the lighter he felt. The weight of his past didn't seem as suffocating when he shared it with someone who understood. Through patience and unwavering support, Ethan watched his father come back to life. One afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, sipping on tea, Jack looked at Ethan and said, "I don't deserve this." Ethan frowned. "Don't say that." Jack shook his head. "I abandoned you. I left you alone. And now, after all these years, you've taken me in, given me a second chance. I don't know how to repay you." Ethan placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to repay me, Dad. Just being here, trying, that's enough." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had believed himself unworthy of love. But his son, his kind, compassionate son, was proving him wrong. And for the first time in decades, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be whole again. Jack sat on the porch, a steaming cup of tea cradled in his hands. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the sky. Ethan sat beside him, waiting patiently. He had learned not to push his father for answers, but tonight, there was something different in Jack's demeanor. An openness, a willingness to finally let go of the past that had haunted him for so long. Jack took a deep breath, staring into the distance. "I suppose you deserve to know," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "About where I've been. About what happened." Ethan remained silent, giving his father the space he needed. "I was young when I enlisted," Jack continued, his eyes clouded with memories. "Barely 20. War changes a man, Ethan. It takes pieces of you, parts you never get back." Jack's hands trembled slightly as he set his cup down. "I lost friends, brothers, really. We depended on each other to stay alive. But war doesn't care about bonds. It rips them apart without mercy." Ethan's heart ached as he listened. He had always known his father had served, but Jack had never spoken about it. Now, the truth was unraveling, raw and painful. There was this mission. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. Everything went wrong. We were ambushed. I watched my closest friend die in my arms. I remember the smell of blood, the screams, the silence that followed when it was all over. That kind of loss, it does something to you. Ethan reached out, placing a hand on his father's arm. "You don't have to go on if it's too painful." Jack shook his head. "I need to," he said firmly. "I need you to understand why I left. When I came home, I wasn't the same man. I tried to be. For you, for your mother. But the nightmares never left me. The guilt, the grief, they consumed me." Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. "I started drinking to forget. At first, it was just a way to silence the ghosts. But soon, it became my escape. Your mother tried to help, but I was too far gone. I didn't want to drag you both down with me. So one day, I walked away." Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent years resenting his father for leaving. But now, hearing the truth, He felt nothing but sorrow for the man who had suffered in silence for so long. "I regret it every day," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Missing you grow up. Not being there for you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just running away." Ethan took a deep breath, his emotions swirling inside him. "I was angry for a long time," he confessed. "I didn't understand why you left. But now I do." Jack looked at his son, his eyes filled with both hope and fear. "Can you forgive me?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached over and pulled his father into a tight embrace. "You're here now. That's what matters." Jack's shoulders shook as he let out a breath he had been holding for years. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. He wasn't alone anymore. He had his son, and together, they would heal. Jack had spent years lost in the darkness, but now, with Ethan's unwavering support, he found himself stepping into the light. As his body regained strength and his mind became clearer, he felt a new sense of purpose stirring within him. He knew the pain of being homeless, of feeling invisible to the world. Now, he wanted to do something about it. One afternoon, Ethan took Jack to a local shelter, a place where volunteers provided meals, warm clothing, and a safe space for the homeless. Jack hesitated at first, unsure if he belonged there as a helper rather than as one in need. But as he stepped inside, he saw the familiar faces of those who had once been his only companions, the weary, the lost, the forgotten. The shelter's coordinator, Maria, was a kind woman in her 50s who had been helping the homeless for decades. She greeted Ethan warmly before turning to Jack. "Ethan's told me a lot about you," she said with a warm smile. "We could use more hands if you're willing." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'd like that," he said softly. From that day forward, Jack became a regular at the shelter. At first, he helped with small tasks, serving meals, cleaning tables, organizing donated clothes. But over time, he realized he had more to offer. He understood these people in a way that many others couldn't. He knew their struggles, their fears, their sense of hopelessness. And because of that, they listened to him. Jack started sharing his story with those who would listen. He spoke to men and women who had given up on themselves, telling them that he had once felt the same way. He let them know that change was possible, that there was a way forward. His words, spoken with sincerity and experience, resonated with many. Soon, Jack began leading support groups at the shelter. He helped others navigate their way to rehabilitation programs, find job opportunities, and reconnect with lost family members. He became a mentor, a friend, a beacon of hope for those who felt abandoned by the world. News of his work spread beyond the shelter. Local organizations invited him to speak at events, to share his journey from despair to redemption. The media picked up his story, portraying him as a symbol of resilience and transformation. Ethan watched in awe as his father flourished. He had once feared that Jack would never recover, that he would remain trapped in his past. But now, he saw a man who had not only overcome his demons but was using his pain to lift others up. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, Jack and Ethan sat together in the living room. Jack looked over at his son, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I never imagined I'd have a second chance at life," he admitted. "I spent so long believing I was beyond saving." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You proved yourself wrong, Dad. And now, you're proving it to so many others." Jack nodded, his heart full. For the first time in decades, he felt like he belonged. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, truly living. And in helping others, he had finally found the purpose he had been searching for all along. Jack had spent years wandering without a place to call home. But now, with Ethan by his side, he was finally learning what it meant to belong. The father and son, once separated by time and pain, were now working together to create something lasting. A home built on love, understanding, and second chances. Ethan knew that his father needed more than just a place to stay. He needed a true home. So, he helped Jack move into a small but cozy house not far from his own. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and filled with the promise of new beginnings. Jack, once a man who had nothing, now had a key to a place where he was always welcome. Adjusting to this new life wasn't easy. Jack had spent years fending for himself, accustomed to solitude and struggle. But Ethan was patient. They spent weekends fixing up the house together, painting the walls, repairing old furniture, and adding personal touches that made it feel like home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack turned to Ethan. "You know, I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "A place to come back to. A family." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You never lost it, Dad. You just needed time to find your way back." Life, of course, wasn't without its challenges. Jack was still adjusting to a world that had changed so much since he had been on the streets. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the past crept in, old habits, old fears, but Ethan was always there to remind him that he wasn't alone. They faced obstacles together. When Jack struggled to find a job, Ethan encouraged him to keep trying. Eventually, Jack found work at the shelter where he had been volunteering. It wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. Helping others gave him strength, and in turn, it strengthened the bond he shared with his son. Ethan, too, found himself growing through this journey. He had spent years searching for his father, but in the process, he discovered something even more valuable: a deeper understanding of resilience, forgiveness, and love. Jack's presence in his life reminded him of what truly mattered. One evening, after a long day at work, Ethan arrived at Jack's house with takeout in hand. As they ate together at the kitchen table, Jack looked around and smiled. "This is what I always wanted," he said. "Not wealth, not success. Just this, dinner with my son. A place to belong." Ethan nodded. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jack chuckled. "That we have. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Together, they had built something that neither of them had expected. A home filled with warmth, trust, and the quiet joy of knowing that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't just surviving. He was truly living, and he had Ethan to thank for that. The years that Jack and Ethan spent together were filled with love, understanding, and redemption. Jack had finally found peace, and Ethan had found the father he had longed for. But time, as always, moved forward, and Jack's body, worn from years of hardship, began to fail him. One evening, as autumn leaves danced outside the window, Jack sat in his favorite chair, gazing at the fading sunlight. Ethan sat beside him, holding his father's hand. Jack's breaths were slower now, but there was a serene expression on his face. "Ethan," Jack whispered, his voice weak but steady, "you've given me more than I ever deserved. A second chance, a home, a son's love." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he squeezed his father's hand gently. "You deserved it, Dad. You always did. I just wish we had more time." Jack smiled faintly. "We had enough," he said. "More than I ever thought possible." The night grew quieter, and Jack's breathing became shallower. Ethan held him close, his heart aching as he felt his father slipping away. Jack looked at him one last time, his eyes full of love and peace. "Thank you, son," he whispered before closing his eyes for the final time. Ethan held on to him, tears streaming down his face. In that moment, grief and love intertwined, wrapping around him like an embrace. Jack was gone, but his presence would never fade. Days turned into weeks, then months. Ethan honored his father's memory by continuing the work Jack had started. He expanded the shelter, dedicating it in his father's name, the Jack Thompson Foundation for Hope. He shared Jack's story with others, ensuring that his struggles and redemption would inspire those who had lost hope. As the years passed, Ethan often found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, just as he and his father had once done. He carried Jack's lessons in his heart, knowing that love, forgiveness, and second chances were the greatest gifts his father had ever given him. The story of Jack and Ethan was one of pain and loss, but also of redemption, love, and the unbreakable bond between father and son. It was a story that proved no matter how lost one might become, there is always a way home. And in the end, love was what remained.